He built an empire on fear. She built him a home out of love. And on the night he thought he was untouchable, laughing with his men, a phone still warm in his jacket pocket, she heard every word, every joke, every insult, every syllable that proved she was nothing to him but furniture in a house she'd bled to build. Damian Calloway runs the East Coast like a general runs a war, but generals don't always see the knife until it's already in. Drop a like. Leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning the phone rang, Claire was on her knees. Not in defeat, though there were days it felt that way, but literally, physically, on the hardwood floor of the East Wing hallway, her jeans stiff with dried joint compound, her knuckles scraped raw from yanking baseboards that hadn't moved since the previous owner put them down in 1987. The mansion had a way of making people humble. Every wall she opened revealed another problem. Every problem she fixed revealed another wall. She had a putty knife in one hand and her phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, half listening to the hold music from the tile supplier because the marble samples for the master bath were a week late, and she'd already rescheduled the contractor twice. The light in the hallway was wrong. She'd noticed it 3 weeks ago and still hadn't sourced the right fixtures, and somewhere above her, one of the second-floor windows had a gap in the seal that let in a thread of cold river air whenever the wind came off the water at a certain angle. It was October. The river was cold. The wind was constant. She found the gap herself. She ordered the sealant herself. She climbed the ladder herself. That was how most things went at the Calloway Riverside estate. The hold music cut out. A board representative came on the line and told her the Calicotta slabs were delayed another 10 days, possibly 2 weeks, depending on the port situation. Claire set down the putty knife, pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead, and said calmly, "That wasn't acceptable. Could they look at alternate sourcing from the Atlanta warehouse?" The representative said he'd have to check. Claire said she'd hold. The music came back. She picked up the putty knife and went back to the baseboard. That was a Tuesday. She would think about that Tuesday later, the specific texture of it, the boredom, the competence, the way she'd simply kept working because that was what she did. And she would feel something close to grief for the woman on that floor who still believed the work meant something to somebody other than herself. She'd been with Damian Calloway for 14 months. 11 of those months she'd spent on this house. The estate sat on 4 private acres at a bend in the Savannah River, 40 minutes from the city, screened from the road by a wall of old live oaks whose roots had been quietly lifting the brick perimeter wall for years. The previous owner, a retired developer who'd made his money in coastal resorts and spent the last decade of his life quietly drinking away the memory of 2 lawsuits and a federal audit, had let the place go in the way that only truly expensive houses can go. Grandly, expensively, with the structural dignity still mostly intact, but the life completely drained out. It needed everything. New roof over the east wing, replumbed bathrooms, an electrical panel that wasn't a fire risk. The kitchen was a disaster. The pool house had black mold behind the wainscoting. The main staircase had 3 steps that flexed wrong when you put your weight on them, and Claire had learned to feel which ones they were by the specific way the wood spoke under her foot, the way you learn the personality of a place when you spend enough time alone inside it. She'd learned this place very well. Damian had bought it the way he bought most things, quickly, with cash, and with the particular male confidence of someone who has never had to personally manage the consequences of an impulse. He'd walked through once with a real estate agent, stood in the great room looking out at the river bend, and said, "Yeah, I want this." The inspection report sat unread in a drawer somewhere. He'd handed Claire the keys 2 weeks later, told her she had good taste, and suggested she do something with it. Then he'd gone back to the city and his business and his men, and whatever it was that constituted his actual daily life, which Claire had learned, slowly and then all at once, to understand as a place she was not fully permitted to enter. She did not dwell on that then. She had a project. The problem, or rather, one of the problems, the logistical surface problem beneath which the real problem lived like groundwater, was that Damian's name was not on most of the accounts. This was not intentional design on anyone's part. It was operational laziness wearing the costume of trust. The utility deposits required a locally verifiable credit history, and Damian's financial footprint was deliberately professionally obscured. The contractors wanted payment histories, references, someone who answered their calls. The alarm and gate security company needed a named contact who was actually reachable. The housekeeping service that came twice a week needed a card on file. One by one, without anyone sitting down and making a decision about it, those accounts ended up under Claire Whitmore's name, her credit history, her phone number, her email address. She noticed. She filed it away. It felt, at the time, like one of those minor administrative asymmetries that relationships produce when one person is more available than the other. She told herself she'd sort it out eventually, transfer things over, get his people involved. She told herself that a lot of things she'd sort out eventually. She kept working. Damien Calloway was 41 years old and had been running the Calloway operation since he was 33, when his uncle Marcus died of a coronary in the back of a restaurant in Beaufort, and left behind an organization that was either a going concern or a liability, depending on who you asked and how much they knew. Damien had spent 2 years quietly making sure it became a going concern. He was precise, disciplined, and operated with a kind of institutional coldness that his captains had learned to read as respect, and his enemies had learned to read as warning. He did not make scenes. He did not lose his temper in front of people. He played chess while everyone else was playing checkers, and he knew it and was not above letting you see that he knew it. He was also, in the private architecture of his personality, a man who needed an audience for everything. The deals, the power, the cars, the clothes, all of it was performance. All of it was aimed at the faces of other men to watch for the specific flicker of recognition that meant they understood who they were dealing with. He had grown up without that recognition. He had spent 30 years earning it. He was not done spending. Claire had understood this about him before she understood much else. She'd met him at a charity event she'd attended with a colleague. She worked in interior design, commercial and high-end residential, had built a small firm with a good reputation and a wait list. And Damien had approached her directly. No preamble, no maneuvering, just stood in front of her and said he'd heard she was good at taking broken things and making them livable. She'd laughed, because it was an odd thing to say, and he'd smiled at her laugh like he'd been aiming for it, and that had been the beginning. She was 34. She'd had 2 serious relationships before him, both of which had ended in the soft, mutual exhaustion of 2 people who liked each other well enough, but had run out of things to say. With Damien, there was never a shortage of things to say, or a shortage of tension, or a shortage of the particular electricity that exists between people when both of them are smart, and neither of them fully trust the other yet. She thought the trust would come. She thought that was what the time was for. She moved some of her things to his apartment in the city. She kept her own place. She told her business partner Tessa that she was seeing someone, that it was complicated, that she'd explain more when there was more to explain. Tessa, who had known Claire for 9 years and had a forensic understanding of her patterns, said, "He's trouble." Claire said, "Obviously." Tessa said, "Just so you know what you're signing up for." Claire said she knew. She was telling the truth and also not telling the truth in equal measure. The work on the estate began in earnest that November, nearly a year before the Tuesday with the putty knife. She'd walked through it properly with a contractor she trusted, a man named Walt Reeves, who'd done 2 of her commercial projects and had the particular quality she valued most in contractors, which was that he told her what was actually wrong instead of what she wanted to hear. Walt walked through the east wing and the pool house and the main kitchen and said, in his flat, unhurried way, that the previous owner had been creatively optimistic about the building's condition and that they were looking at a serious renovation, probably 12 to 14 months if nothing unexpected came up, and something always came up. She told Damien this. Damien said, "Do what needs to be done. I trust you." He said this the way a person says a thing when they have not fully processed what the thing means. She laid out a preliminary budget. He approved it without reading it closely. She set up the project accounts. She started scheduling contractors. She started spending her weekends at the estate, driving the 40 minutes from the city, unlocking the heavy iron gates with a code she'd set herself, walking through the empty rooms with a flashlight and a notebook, cataloging what needed to happen next. The loneliness of those early weeks was something she didn't talk about. It wasn't the ordinary loneliness of being alone. She'd spent plenty of time alone and was reasonably comfortable in her own company. It was the specific loneliness of doing important work in a context that nobody else seemed to notice was important. Damien came out maybe once a month. He'd walk through, look around, say something like, "Looking good," or "When does the kitchen start?" And then his phone would ring and he'd drift back to his car and she'd hear the gravel crunching under his tires as he pulled away, and she'd stand in whatever room she was currently focused on and breathe until the feeling passed, and then she'd get back to work. She told herself this was temporary, that once the house was finished, it would become the thing it was supposed to be, their place, their retreat, the tangible evidence of a future. She told herself the investment of her time and attention was an investment in something real. Walt kept his head down and his opinion to himself. His crew liked Claire because she was straight with them, paid on time, and didn't pretend to know more than she did while also not pretending to know less. She learned to read a subfloor. She learned the difference between structural damage and cosmetic damage, and the specific anxiety that lived in the gap between them. She learned to talk to plumbers and electricians with the fluency of someone who'd been doing this for years, which, in a way, she had, just in commercial spaces, not houses, not places that were supposed to mean something. She financed a significant portion of the early work herself. Not the structural costs. Those came out of the account Damien had set up. But the details, the soft costs, the things that fell into the category of just get it done and we'll sort it out. She didn't keep meticulous records at first because she trusted that it would work out. Later, she would keep very meticulous records, but for different reasons. October arrived and the east wing was nearly done, and the kitchen was gutted and half rebuilt, and the master bath was waiting on the delayed marble, and Claire had been at the house 4 of the past 6 weekends, sometimes overnight, sleeping on an air mattress in the one finished bedroom because it was too late to drive back, and she was too tired to care. Her hands had developed calluses she hadn't had a year ago. She'd stopped wearing her good clothes to the site. She kept a pair of steel-toed boots in her car that she'd bought after she dropped a section of quarter round on her foot in July. Damien called when he called. Sometimes every day. Sometimes a gap of 4 or 5 days during which she understood he was handling something and she should not expect to hear from him, and she should not ask about it when she did. She had, over the course of 14 months, quietly calibrated herself to the rhythms of his availability. She had done this without fully acknowledging that she was doing it, which is how calibration works. It happens below the level of conscious decision until one day you look at your life and realize you've rearranged most of it around a shape that wasn't yours to begin with. That Tuesday in October, after the tile supplier finally confirmed the alternate sourcing and she'd scheduled the contractor and swept up the baseboard debris and washed her hands in the single working bathroom and stood in the kitchen looking at the rough plywood counter where marble would eventually be, Damien called. She answered on the second ring. "Hey." His voice, even through the phone, had a specific quality, a compression, a density, like someone who'd spent years using words economically and had never fully let go of that discipline even in private. "Hey," she said, "the Calicotta is coming out of Atlanta. Should be here end of next week." "Good." A pause. "You're still out there?" "Finishing up. I want to look at the window seal in the upstairs guest room before I leave. There's a draft situation I've been—" "Claire." The way he said her name, not unkind, just final, like a period. "You don't have to give me a project report every time I call." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I know. I'm just thinking out loud." "Come into the city this weekend. Stay at the apartment." "I was going to—" "The house will still be broken next week. Come in." She thought about the window seal. She thought about the list on her phone of 17 things she'd wanted to do before the weekend was over. She thought about the air mattress and the river sound, and the particular stillness of the place at night when the contractors were gone, and it was just her and the unfinished rooms, and the sense that she was the only thing holding the project together, which she was, because she was. "Okay," she said. "Good." Another pause, and she heard background noise suddenly. Voices, the specific murmur and scrape of a room filling with people. "Hold on a second," he said, not to her, to someone in the room. Then to her, "I'll call you tomorrow, yeah?" "Sure," she said. And then she heard the click that she assumed was him ending the call, except her phone didn't register the disconnection. The call timer was still running. She looked at the screen. Still connected, still live, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. and she thought, he's going to realize in a second and hang up. She should hang up. She started to pull the phone from her ear. Then she heard his voice, and he was laughing. Not the contained laugh he used with her, calibrated, aware of itself. This was the other laugh, the one that came from a different part of him, the part that existed in rooms she didn't enter. Full-throated, easy, a little cruel at the edges, the way laughter sounds when a man is performing for other men. She stood very still. "Should see this place, seriously," he was saying, and there were other voices responding, layered, overlapping, male voices in the specific register of men who are comfortable with each other and not being watched. 4 acres on the river, marble bathrooms, the whole thing. Someone said something she couldn't catch. Damien laughed again. "Nah, I don't do that shit. You know me, I handed her the keys and said, make it work." More laughter from the room. "She's been out there every weekend for 11 months, maybe 12. A voice, rough, southern, she didn't recognize it. "She charging you for it?" "Barely," Damien said, and there was something in the way he said it, dismissive and light, that landed wrong. "You know how women get when they're invested in a project. I let her run with it. A beat. She lives out there now, basically. Smells like it, too. Every time she comes in, she's got paint in her hair, and she smells like—" He paused, and she heard him searching for words, and she already knew, somewhere in her chest, that she didn't want to hear the ones he found. Like sweat and old lumber and wet paint. Laughter, his included, easy, unguarded, the laugh of a man who does not believe he is being heard. "That's your girlfriend, man," another voice said. I know, Damien said, and his tone suggested it was a minor inconvenience, a thing to be managed, like the delayed marble or the window seal. "She's good people. She needs the project. You know what I mean? Gives her something to do." Gives her something to do. Claire was standing in the gutted kitchen of the house she had spent 11 months bleeding into, and she was very still, and the phone was warm against her palm, and the call timer said 6 minutes and 48 seconds, and outside the window the river moved in its October silence, cold and indifferent, and she understood, in the specific way that understanding arrives when it's been waiting a long time and has finally run out of patience, that she had made a serious miscalculation. Not about the house. About what the house meant. The voices on the phone continued. Someone made a joke about the renovation wife, and there was laughter, and the conversation moved on to other things. Something about a shipment, something about a meeting in Charleston. And Claire stood there and let it run because she couldn't think of what else to do with her hands, and because part of her was still waiting for the moment when Damien would realize the call was open, when his voice would shift, when the performance would stop. He didn't realize. The call ran another 4 minutes before someone must have jostled his jacket, and the line dropped. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The river outside made no sound she could name. She did not call him back that night. She drove the 40 minutes to the city in a particular silence that wasn't peaceful. That was the silence of someone metabolizing something that hadn't finished hitting yet. She went to her own apartment, not his, and she stood in her own kitchen, which was clean and finished and not her work. And she opened a bottle of wine and poured a glass and sat at the table and did not drink it. She thought about the number of Saturdays. She had calculated this before, idly, but she calculated it now with a different kind of attention. 47 Saturdays at the estate, approximately, over the course of 11 months. Some of them full days, 8, 10 hours. Some of them half days. Some of them long enough that she'd slept there. She thought about the contractor invoices she'd fronted herself. She'd started keeping those records in April, after the 3rd time a check from Damien's account arrived late enough to hold up a project phase. She thought about the utility deposits, and the security system, and the housekeeping service, and the landscaping company, and the name on every account, which was hers, all of them, because he was always handling family business, and she was always available. She was always available. She sat with that for a while. What she felt was not primarily rage. Rage would have been simpler. What she felt was closer to grief, complicated by the dawning awareness that the grief was for something that had never fully existed. She had believed, without ever quite articulating the belief, that the work was an expression of love, and that the love was mutual, that she was building something with someone even if she was doing it alone. The phone call had clarified something she had not wanted to see clearly. To Damien, She was not a partner in the building of a life. She was a capable resource deployed in service of his image, and he found her devotion a little pathetic, and he found her smell funny, and he'd said so, easily, to a room full of men who worked for him. She finished the glass of wine. She poured another. She did not drink that one either. She thought about what Tessa had said when this started, just so you know what you're signing up for. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then, or hadn't admitted she knew. She thought about the accounts, her name on all of them, the utility contracts, the security registration, the housekeeping service, the landscaping, the suppliers, 47 Saturdays, and a legitimate paper trail documenting who had actually built Damien Calloway's Riverside estate. She picked up her phone. She opened the Notes app. She started making a list, not of things to do this weekend, not of project phases or contractor schedules or supplier follow-ups, but of everything she controlled. Everything that was, technically, by the most basic operational logic, hers. The list was longer than she'd expected. She sat there for a long time, writing and thinking, and at some point the wine got warm and the night got late, and she thought about the way Damien's voice had sounded when he said, "Gives her something to do." That casual dismissal, that easy contempt dressed up as tolerance. And she felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. Not angry. Not anymore. She was past the anger, moving through it into something quieter and more precise. And she understood that she was not going to have a confrontation. She was not going to call him crying. She was not going to send a message explaining what she'd heard and how it made her feel, and asking for an apology that would arrive polished and insufficient. Damien Calloway ran an empire. He understood power. He understood leverage. He understood that the person who controls the infrastructure controls the situation. She knew this because she had listened to him, actually listened, for 14 months. She also understood something he apparently had not considered. She had been the infrastructure all along. She set down her phone. She looked at the list. She thought about the weekend he'd mentioned, his captains, the gathering he was planning, the chance to show off the estate to the men whose regard he valued above everything else. She thought about what that weekend would look like without electricity, without water, without stocked kitchens or made-up bedrooms or the housekeeping service she'd arranged, without the gate code she'd set, without any of the dozens of invisible systems she'd put in place to make a broken house function like a palace. She thought about the envelope she would leave on the kitchen island. Not rage, not grief, not revenge in the dramatic cinematic sense, something colder and more anatomical than any of that. The precise surgical act of making a man understand the weight of what he'd dismissed. She picked up her phone again. She started making a different kind of list. Outside, the city ran its night sounds, traffic, distance, the river somewhere beyond the buildings, cold and moving, going where it was always going regardless of what happened on its banks. Claire Whitmore sat at her table in the quiet of her own apartment, and she planned with the same competence and attention she had brought to every phase of the project. And she did not rush, and she did not second-guess herself, and she was not afraid of what came next. She had spent 11 months learning what it took to make that house work. Now she was going to demonstrate what it took to make it. She made the first call at 7:30 in the morning, not to Damien, not to Tessa, to the security company, a mid-sized firm out of Augusta that handled gate access, perimeter monitoring, and the keypad system she'd had installed on every exterior door of the estate. The account representative who picked up was a woman named Denise, who Claire had dealt with a dozen times over the past 8 months, mostly for system updates and code changes. And Denise knew her voice the way service reps know the voices of clients who actually follow up on things. "Whitmore account," Claire said. "I need to schedule a service suspension." A pause. "Suspension as in temporary shutdown?" "Temporary. The estate is going to be unoccupied for an extended period, and I want the exterior monitoring maintained, but the gate access code's deactivated. I'll give you the window." Denise asked for dates. Claire gave them. She gave the start date as the Thursday before the weekend Damien had announced his gathering, early enough that anyone who tried the existing codes would find them dead, late enough that there was no visible anomaly in the days before. She asked Denise to confirm the suspension in writing to her email. Denise said she would. Claire thanked her and ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her Notes app and put a small check mark next to the first item on the list. There were 16 items on the list. She went down them in the order she'd written them, which was roughly the order in which they would matter. The systems that would be noticed first if they were absent, working back to the ones whose absence would only become apparent once the more obvious failures had already done their damage. It was the way she thought about renovation projects. You sequence the work so that each phase enables the next, and you never tear out something structural until you know what's going to hold the ceiling up in its place. Only this time, she was working in reverse. She was identifying the load-bearing elements and scheduling their removal. The electricity was under her name through a business account she'd set up when she registered the renovation project as a temporary commercial operation. It had simplified billing and given her access to contractor rates. She called the provider and requested a service interruption for the same window, citing a planned outage for panel work. The representative said that was standard. Did she need a confirmation number? She said yes. The water was municipal, also under her name, also straightforward. She called. She requested a temporary disconnection. She was told it would take 48 hours to process. She said that was fine, gave the dates, confirmed her account details. The housekeeping service was a woman named Rosa Mendez, who ran a small crew of 4 and came to the estate Tuesdays and Fridays. Claire had hired Rosa in March, had given her the gate code and a key to the service entrance, and had developed the kind of comfortable, functional relationship with her that develops between two professionals who respect each other's work. She texted Rosa that morning, not called, because calling felt like it required an explanation, and told her the estate was going to be closed for a private event the following weekend and her services wouldn't be needed until the Monday after. Rosa texted back a thumbs up. Claire stared at that thumbs up for a long moment. It was such a small, ordinary response to a thing that was not small at all. She moved through the rest of the list with the same attention she brought to a project specification document. Food deliveries. She had a standing arrangement with a supplier in the city who restocked the estate's dry goods and refrigerated items every 2 weeks. She called and pushed the delivery date back. The linen service that handled the guest bedrooms, she called and suspended pickup and delivery for 2 weeks. The landscaping crew that came Saturdays, she called and rescheduled. One by one, each small mechanism that made the house function as a livable space rather than a collection of expensive rooms was quietly, professionally, and completely withdrawn. She did not dramatize any of it. She made each call in the same even tone she used for contractor scheduling, and she wrote down the confirmation numbers and she checked the items off the list. By 10:45 that morning, she had made 9 calls and sent 3 emails, and the estate, to anyone looking from the outside, would appear exactly as it had the day before, right up until the moment it didn't. The cosmetic work was the only part that required her physical presence, and she drove out to the estate that afternoon. Not with the usual weight of the project on her, but with something different, something cleaner. She had 4 things left to finish. The front entrance detail work, the millwork around the main door frame that needed a final coat and would photograph beautifully. The great room fireplace surround, which she'd been saving because the stonework was intricate and she'd wanted to give it proper attention. The landing at the top of the main staircase, where she'd ordered a custom light fixture that had finally arrived and needed to be mounted, and the view from the great room windows, the river visible through the glass, the cleaned exterior window surface, the interior trim finished to the point where anyone standing in that room would understand immediately that this was a house of consequence. She worked until dark. Walt had finished his cruise portion weeks earlier, and the site was hers alone now, her and the house in its nearly completed state. She worked with the specific focus of someone who knows this is the last time, who puts that knowledge into their hands rather than their head. She got the millwork right. She got the fireplace surround right. She mounted the light fixture on the landing and stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at it. And it was exactly what she'd imagined 11 months ago when she'd stood in the same spot with a flashlight and a notebook and an idea of what this place could be. She stood there for a while. The house was quiet. The river made its sound through the sealed windows. Then she went to the kitchen, found a notepad in the drawer she'd stocked herself, and she wrote 1 sentence. She put it in an envelope. She put the envelope on the kitchen island, in the center, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in from the side entrance. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned off the lights. The last time those lights would come on under her hand. And she walked to her car, and she drove back to the city, and she did not look in the rearview mirror because she already knew what the house looked like from the outside. beautiful and finished and lit by the October sunset, and she did not need to carry that image with her. Woke. Damien called Wednesday. She answered. "You coming out this weekend?" he said. "I told the guys you'd be there." She had been waiting for this, not anxiously, but with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what they're going to say and is simply waiting for the moment to say it. "I can't," she said. "I've got a client situation I need to handle." A beat. "What client situation?" "The Hargrove project. There's a delivery issue." There was no Hargrove issue, but there was a Hargrove project, a commercial renovation in Midtown that she'd been managing in parallel with the estate, because her actual life and her actual work had continued during the 11 months she'd spent rebuilding Damien's house. And he would know the name, she'd mentioned it before. Claire, the compression in his voice, the period at the end of her name. "I told these guys the estate was done. I said they'd see the finished product this weekend." "It is done," she said. "Mostly, you'll be fine." Mostly. The main spaces are finished. Kitchen, great room, the master suite, all the guest rooms on the second floor. It looks exactly like you wanted it to look. This was true. It did look exactly like he wanted it. It looked better. Everything you need to show them is there. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking or doing whatever Damien did that passed for thinking when he was deciding whether to push back on something. "You should be there," he said. "These guys, they know about you, about what you did out there." "What did you tell them?" she said, and she kept her voice exactly even. "That you handled the renovation, that you've got an eye for it." She handled the renovation. She had an eye for it. "I'm sure you'll be able to show them around," she said. "You know the house." A pause that went on long enough that she understood he was recalibrating. "Everything set up for the weekend?" "It's all taken care of," she said. This was also true. Everything had been taken care of with great precision. "You'll have everything you deserve." She said it without emphasis. He heard it without suspicion, because why would he hear anything in it? "Okay," he said. "I'll call you after." "Sure," she said. She put the phone down and looked at the wall of her office. A wall that held the framed prints she'd chosen years before she met Damien, that reflected a version of herself she'd existed as before any of this. And she breathed slowly once, and then she opened her laptop and went back to the actual Hargrove project because she had a business to run, and that business was entirely her own and always had been. Thursday night, Tessa came by. They'd had dinner scheduled, a standing monthly thing they'd maintained since starting the firm together, one of those rituals that exists as a kind of calibration, a check-in between two people who work closely enough together that the friendship requires occasional separate maintenance. They went to a Thai place 3 blocks from Claire's apartment, sat at the table in the back corner they always took, and ordered the same things they always ordered. And Tessa looked at Claire over her water glass and said, "You're different." "Different how?" "I don't know." Settled. Claire picked up her chopsticks. "I made a decision." Tessa waited. Tessa was good at waiting. It was one of the things that made her effective as a business partner, and also, sometimes, slightly unnerving as a friend. "I'm done with Damien," Claire said. Tessa set down her water glass. "Done, done?" "Done, done." "What happened?" Claire told her about the phone call. Not all of it. She kept the specific words compressed, because saying them out loud required a particular kind of exposure she wasn't ready for yet. But enough. The dinner, the men, the accent he put on, "She's been out there every weekend," the easy laughter, the phrase gives her something to do. Tessa was quiet when Claire finished, then, "Did you confront him?" "No." Another pause. "So what are you doing?" "I told you, I'm done." "You're doing something," Tessa said. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The look you get on projects when you figured out the sequencing and you're just waiting to execute." Tessa leaned back. "Claire, what are you doing?" Claire looked at her. She thought about explaining the accounts, the list, the calls she'd made, the envelope on the kitchen island, the weekend that was coming. She thought about how it would sound. She thought about whether it was the kind of thing that needed explaining or the kind of thing that simply needed to happen. "He told those men I built that house to give myself something to do," she said. "His house. That I paid for, scheduled, managed, and built over 11 months on my weekends. Tessa said nothing. I want him to understand what it feels like when the thing you've dismissed as inconsequential turns out to be the only thing holding your world together. Tessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Is it legal?" "Every account is in my name. Every service I suspended is a service I set up and I'm paying for. I have the contracts." Claire picked up her chopsticks again. "I haven't broken anything. I've just stopped fixing things." Tessa looked at her for a while with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then she said, "He's not going to take this well." "No, he's—" Tessa stopped. They both knew what Damien Calloway was. They had never said it plainly, but they both knew it, the way you know things you've decided are manageable until they suddenly aren't. "He's going to come after you." "Let him come," Claire said. "I've documentation going back 11 months. Invoices, bank records, account registrations, everything." She met Tessa's eyes. "He can explain to whoever he wants why a woman he mocked in front of his men has a legal and financial claim to every significant improvement made to his property for the past year." Tessa was silent for a beat. Then, slowly, she picked up her own chopsticks. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They ate. The conversation moved to other things. The Hargrove project, a new inquiry they'd had from a developer in Savannah, the landlord issue with their studio space, normal things, business things, the architecture of a life that existed independently of Damien Calloway and always had. When they said goodnight outside the restaurant, Tessa hugged her, held on a beat longer than usual, didn't say anything. Claire understood what the silence meant and was grateful for it. She walked home alone. The night was cold, properly cold now. The October chill that in this part of Georgia presages nothing dramatic. No harsh winter, just a long, slow settling toward gray. She walked with her hands in her pockets and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, which told her something about where she was in the process. Past the planning, past the grief, past the anger that had only lasted about 6 hours before it cured itself into something more durable. She slept well that night. She had not slept well in a long time. Friday came in overcast and cold, the river country smell of the air different from the city's exhaust and concrete, and at 4 in the afternoon Damien texted her, "Heading out now, 6 of us. Tell Rosa to have the kitchen stocked." She read the text. She did not respond. At 4:45, Claire, she... At 5:10, "You around?" At 5:30, when they would have been pulling up the long private drive through the live oaks, the brick wall with its lifted roots, toward the iron gates that looked exactly as they always looked, except that the keypad would return nothing when Damien punched in the code. At 5:30, her phone rang. She let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She watched the voicemail notification appear. She did not listen to it. It rang again 40 seconds later. She let it ring. The third call she answered because she had decided she would answer the third call, because she needed to hear what he sounded like from the other side of it. "The gate code isn't working." His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it she recognized. The specific register of Damien Calloway encountering a situation he hadn't modeled for, a thing that wasn't behaving the way things were supposed to behave when he was present. It was not a sound he made often. She had heard it twice before in 14 months, and both times it had preceded something she hadn't enjoyed witnessing. "Oh," she said. A pause. "What do you mean, oh?" "I mean, the code should work. Did you try it again?" "Claire." The period, the compression, but tighter now, compressed against something. "I tried it 3 times. There are 6 of us standing in a driveway." "That's strange," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm, which she had practiced being, which was not difficult because the calm was not performed. It was actual. It had been actual since Wednesday. It was the calm of a woman who has finished grieving and begun the next thing. "The security company might have done a system reset. They mentioned they were doing maintenance." She paused. "I'm sure there's a manual override. Have you tried the call box?" A silence. She could hear him processing, deciding, the sound of 6 men waiting in a driveway behind him. "There's no power to the call box." She said. "That's odd. Let me... Hold on." She moved through her apartment to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, closed the refrigerator. She counted to 12. I'm not finding anything in my notes about a planned outage. Did Walt leave a number for the electrical contractor? I can try calling. We climbed the wall, he said flatly. She had expected this. The wall was 4 feet at its lowest point. Okay, she said. So you're inside? We're inside. There's no power in the house. The house? Claire. His voice dropped, which was more alarming than if it had risen. This was the operational voice, the voice that existed below anger because anger was a luxury. There is no power. There is no water. The kitchen has nothing in it. The beds are stripped. What is going on? She let a beat pass. 2 beats. She was looking out her kitchen window at the city evening, the lights coming on in the building across the street, someone moving in a lit window, the ordinary texture of the world continuing at its ordinary pace. I don't know, she said. I scheduled everything. I thought it was all set up. You thought. Damien, whose name is on the utility accounts. Not a question, a calculation. She heard him arriving at it in real time, the math of the situation resolving in his head, and she felt something. Not satisfaction exactly, but the close cousin of satisfaction, the feeling of a precisely planned thing performing exactly as designed. Mine, she said. The silence on the line was not the silence of processing anymore. It was a different quality of silence. She had heard this particular silence from Damien only once before, in a conversation she'd witnessed, not been part of, when someone had misled him about something consequential. It was the silence of a man deciding what to do with information he hadn't wanted to receive. Get in your car, he said. Come out here. I can't, she said. I'm sorry. I've got Claire. The word arrived like a door closing. Get in your car. Damien, she said, and her voice was the same, still the same, the calm that was not performed. I'm not coming out there tonight. I think you and your guests should probably find somewhere else to stay. I'm sorry about the mix-up with the services. I'll look into it tomorrow. She heard him exhale, a single controlled breath that told her more than any sentence could. We will talk about this, he said. I know, she said. You understand what I'm saying. I do. Claire. Good night, Damien, she said, and she ended the call and set the phone face down on the counter and stood in her kitchen in the ordinary evening light and breathed once, twice, 3 times, and felt the last trembling edge of something she'd been carrying for 11 months finally, completely let go. Her phone buzzed against the counter. She didn't pick it up. It buzzed again and again. And then, after a while, it stopped. She stood at the window and watched the city go dark around its edges and bright at its center the way cities do. And she thought, tomorrow he will be angrier, and the day after that angrier still. And at some point the anger will find its shape and aim itself at her, and she needed to be ready for that. She needed to have every invoice and every bank record and every account document exactly where she could put her hands on it in under 2 minutes. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen island, the single sentence she'd written on the notepad from the drawer she'd stocked herself. In the kitchen she'd rebuilt from raw plywood and a contractor's vision and her own refusal to let anything be less than what she'd imagined. She thought about him reading it, about the room full of men reading it over his shoulder, understanding in one sentence what 11 months of invisible labor had actually been worth and to whom it had actually belonged. She thought about the faces of those men, the ones who'd laughed about sweat and old lumber and wet paint, standing in beautiful, finished, completely non-functional rooms, and understanding that the woman they'd dismissed as a renovation wife she was on her second cup of coffee when the knock came. Not a buzz from the lobby intercom, not a text message. An actual knock on her apartment door at 7:42 in the morning, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. 3 impacts, flat-palmed, the sound of someone who has made decisions about this visit before arriving. Claire set her cup down on the kitchen counter. She was dressed. She was always dressed before 7, had been since her mid-20s when she'd learned that the day had a way of ambushing people who weren't ready for it. She looked at the door. She did not move toward it immediately. She stood in her kitchen and breathed and listened to the quality of the silence after the knock and understood from that silence alone that it was not Damien on the other side of the door. Damien did not knock like that. Damien had a way of making even his knocks feel considered, controlled. This knock had a different author. She crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. Two men in the hallway. She didn't recognize either of them, which was itself a piece of information. Both of them were the specific kind of large that comes from deliberate construction rather than genetics, and both of them were standing with the particular stillness of men who are paid to wait and are good at it. The one on the left had a jacket that didn't hang right on his right side. She did not open the door. "Who is it?" she said. "Ms. Whitmore." The voice belonged to neither of the men she could see. It came from the left, out of her peephole's field of view, and it was a voice she recognized despite not having heard it in person before. A voice she'd heard through a phone speaker on a Tuesday night in October, rough and southern, and carrying the easy weight of someone who considers himself a man of consequence. "My name is Carter Reese. I work for Damien. He'd like you to come with us." She kept her voice even. "He can call me. He'd prefer in person. I prefer the phone." A pause. She heard Carter Reese shift his weight. She could hear it through the door, the small sound of a large man adjusting his stance. "Miss Whitmore," he said again, and this time the courtesy in it was thinner, more structural, a framework holding something heavier underneath. "I'm going to be straight with you. Mr. Calloway is not in a patient place this morning. I'm here to make this easy. I'd appreciate if you'd let me do that." She looked at the two men through the peephole. She thought about the chain lock. Engaged, but a chain lock was two screws in a door frame, and she knew because she'd installed it herself. She thought about her phone on the kitchen counter. She thought about Tessa, who lived 12 minutes away, and who she had not, she now realized, told specifically what she was planning or what weekend it was planned for. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen island and the sentence inside it, and the version of last night she had imagined. Damien reading it alone, understanding it, the men dispersing in their private shame. And she understood that something had gone differently than she'd imagined, and that the difference was standing in her hallway in a jacket that didn't hang right. She went to the kitchen. She picked up her phone. She typed a message to Tessa. 4 words. "Carter Reese, Damien's man, at my door," and sent it. Then she typed a second message with her home address, which Tessa already had, but she sent it anyway. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket, which she was wearing because she was always dressed before 7, and she went back to the door and opened it. Carter Reese was 50-something, lean in the way that men get lean when they've spent decades doing physical things, and the muscle has settled into something more fundamental than size. He had a face that had been rearranged at some point by something and had healed into a new configuration that was not unpleasant but was permanently asymmetrical. He looked at Claire with the professional neutrality of a man who has collected many people from many doorways and regards it as a logistical exercise. "Thank you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere with those two," she said, nodding toward the men behind him. Carter looked at her for a moment. Then, without turning around, "Wait downstairs." The men went. Carter looked back at Claire. "Mr. Calloway is at the Meridian. You know it?" She knew it. A private members' club in the historic district, the kind of place that had been a cotton factor's office in a previous century and currently served as one of several legitimate facades for Damien's organizational infrastructure. She had been there twice for dinner. The food was good. The other diners had the particular quality of people who know better than to look at each other directly. "I'll drive myself," she said. Carter considered this. "All right," he said. Then, "Ms. Whitmore, I've been with Damien Calloway for 11 years. I want to tell you something that isn't my business to tell you." He paused, and she saw something move behind his asymmetrical face, something that was not sympathy exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. "He's not angry. I've seen Damien angry. This is something else. You should be careful how you walk into that room." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means he's been in that building since 2 in the morning. It means he spent most of the night on the phone." Carter stopped. "It means you did something that reached further than you meant it to." She held his gaze. "What did I do that I didn't mean to do?" Carter looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him decide not to answer, and that decision was itself an answer of a kind that she felt in the back of her throat. "I'll meet you there," she said. The Meridian's main room was empty at 8 in the morning, except for a bartender polishing glasses at the far end of the bar who did not look up when she came in. Claire had been shown through by a man at the front who knew her face. She had been here with Damien, she was expected. And she walked through the dim, wood-paneled quiet of the place and thought about Carter Reese's face in her hallway, the thing he'd decided not to say. Damien was in the back room. She'd been in this room once before, briefly. When Damien had used it for a call he didn't want to take in the main room. It was small, windowless, with a round table and 4 chairs and a sideboard and a single overhead fixture that gave the light a specific quality, direct, unforgiving, the kind of light that exists in rooms where the truth is expected to be present. He was sitting at this table with his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of something amber in front of him that might have been his first of the morning or his last of the night. He looked like a man who had not slept. He did not look like a man who had been crying or raging or doing any of the things Claire had imagined in her kitchen last night. He looked like a man who had been calculating. She sat down across from him without being invited to. She put her hands flat on the table, palms down, and she looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. This was one of Damien's techniques. She'd seen him use it on other people. The silence as instrument, the patience as pressure. She had always found it interesting to watch. She found it less interesting from the inside. "The envelope was a nice touch," he said finally. "Thank you. I read it twice." He picked up the glass, turned it, set it back down without drinking. "You want to know what my first reaction was?" "Not particularly." His eyes moved to her face. They were dark and still, and she had learned to read the stillness as a warning. Not a threat, a warning, which were different things. "Respect," he said. "That was my first reaction. I want you to know that, because it's the truth, and I'm telling it to you even though it is not what you'd expect me to say." Claire said nothing. "And then my second reaction," he said, "was to think about the 6 men who were standing in that kitchen when I read it, who saw my face when I read it, who understood what it said." "Good," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A 1/4 inch in the jaw, a slight adjustment of the orbital muscles around his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "Not good. Claire, not good." He leaned forward. "2 of those men are not my captains. They are not my employees. They are men from the Renner organization out of Atlanta. We were hosting them because we are currently in a negotiation, a significant negotiation, one I have been working toward for 8 months. And I brought them to that estate because I wanted them to see stability. I wanted them to see that Damien Calloway's house is in order, that his life is in order." She felt something shift in the room, a temperature change that had nothing to do with the air. And instead, he said, they saw a dark house and a stripped kitchen and a note from a woman saying, "I don't respect her." He stopped. He let that sit. "The Renner people left at 6 in the morning. I got a call from their representative at 7. The negotiation is suspended, possibly terminated." Claire looked at him. She thought about what Carter Reese had said. "You did something that reached further than you meant it to." She thought about what she had meant to do. Humiliate him in front of his men, yes. Make him feel the weight of her absence, yes. Demonstrate the scope of what he'd dismissed. She had not thought about what his men were there for. She had not known about the Renner negotiation. She had not known there were outsiders in that group, people from a different organization, people for whom the evidence of Damien's domestic disorder would mean something different than embarrassment. She had not known because he had not told her. He never told her. She was not permitted into the rooms where the actual business happened. "I didn't know about the Renner people," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." And the way he said it was not an accusation. It was something worse than an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, the acknowledgement of a structural truth that existed between them that he was now exposing directly. She had not known because he had not shared it because she was not a partner in his life. She was a resource. And now the resource had acted without the information it would have needed to act intelligently. And the consequences were real, and they were his. "That's not my fault," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's mine, I know that." He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't change what happened." She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing even. She thought about the list she'd made, the 16 items, the satisfaction of the check marks, the clean precision of the plan. She thought about how certain she had been, sitting in her apartment Wednesday night, that she knew exactly what she was doing and what it would cost him and what it would cost her. She thought about Carter Reese in her hallway and the thing he'd decided not to say. "What does the Renner situation mean?" she said. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "It means I need to contain the damage, which means I need to give them a version of last night that doesn't look like what it was." He paused. "Which means I need your help." The word arrived in the room like something thrown. She looked at him. She looked at his face, the unchanged face of a man she had loved, in the complicated, partly blind way that intelligent women sometimes love men they know are not entirely safe. And she felt the specific vertigo of a situation reversing its own logic. She had come here to be on the receiving end of consequences, and instead she was being asked to solve a problem which was so perfectly, grotesquely consistent with the fundamental dynamic of the past 14 months that she almost laughed. "You're asking me," she said. "I'm asking you." No apology in it, just the bare operational request. Damien at his most reduced, the performance stripped away. "After what you said about me," he held her gaze. "Yes." "To your men." "Yes." "That I smelled like sweat and lumber." She said it plainly, without heat, which was somehow worse than heat would have been. "That I had nothing better to do." Something moved through his face. It was brief, and it was real. And she had enough history with him to know what it looked like when Damien Calloway actually felt something he hadn't planned to feel. "I said those things," he said. "I said them, and I shouldn't have." "Tell me why you said them." A pause. "Because they were in the room," he said. "Because—" He stopped. He looked at the glass. He looked back at her. "Because that's how I talk in rooms like that. Because it's easier to be the man who has a woman doing his renovation than the man who can't manage his own house. Because I was performing." He said it flatly, without excuse-making in it, which was the closest Damien Calloway came to genuine contrition, and she recognized it as such. "And now you need me to perform again," she said. "I need you to help me fix this." "What does fixing this look like?" He leaned back slightly, the operational register coming back, the calculation returning now that the admission was done. "The Renner people need to see the estate. The finished estate, the way it should have looked Friday night. I need to host them again, dinner, the weekend, whatever it takes. And I need it to look exactly like what I said it was. A complete functioning home." He paused. "I need you there." She sat very still. Outside this windowless room, the city was going about its Saturday morning business. Coffee shops opening, the farmers' market on the square, the ordinary traffic of ordinary lives. And she was in a room with no windows being asked to reassemble the stage she'd deliberately struck, by the man for whom she'd built it, because the audience he'd been hiding from her had seen the bare boards. And in exchange, she said, he looked at her. He knew her. He'd always been good at knowing her, which was one of the reasons it had worked for as long as it had. "What do you want?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about Tessa and the Hargrove project, and the accounts in her name, and the 47 Saturdays and the envelope on the kitchen island. She thought about the version of this she'd planned, the clean exit, the legal separation, the estate that would become hers by force of documentation and 12 months of demonstrable investment. She thought about how certain that plan had felt on Wednesday night, how finished, how exactly calibrated. She thought about the Renner organization out of Atlanta. She thought about what Carter Reese had said about something that reached further than she'd meant it to. She thought about what an organization like Damien's did when it felt threatened, not by a competitor, not by law enforcement, but by an internal disruption that made it look weak in front of people it needed to deal with. She understood, sitting in that chair in that windowless room with her hands flat on that table, that she had aimed a careful, specific weapon, and it had hit something she hadn't seen, and the collateral was significant, and it was pointed, at least partly, in her direction. She was not afraid. But she was honest with herself, and honesty required acknowledging that the terrain had shifted. "I want the estate," she said, "in writing. Whatever legal instrument your people can produce that establishes my ownership or my right of residency, I want it drafted this week." He was quiet for a long moment. "And I want a full accounting," she continued. "Every dollar I spent on that property. Reimbursed. I have the records." "You have the records," he said, not surprised, just confirming the thing he'd already assumed. 11 months of them. He picked up the glass and drank and set it back down. He was looking at her with the same expression he'd used in the real estate agent's office when he'd decided to buy the estate. The expression of a man taking the measure of something, determining its value, deciding whether the cost was acceptable. She held the expression without flinching because she had learned, over 14 months, that flinching was the one thing you could not do in a room with Damien Calloway. "All right," he said. "All right, meaning I'll have the paperwork drawn up. Meaning I'll have your expenses totaled and covered." He paused. "Meaning I need 2 weekends. The renter dinner and the follow-up. After that, the estate is yours and we're square." She looked at him. She looked at the amber glass and the rolled sleeves and the face of a man who had not slept and had not stopped working even in his insomnia. She thought about what square meant when the person using the word was Damien Calloway. Whether it meant finished or whether it meant something more operational, a temporary renegotiation of terms while he regrouped, a pause rather than a conclusion. She thought about the fact that she was in this room at all, that Carter Reese had knocked on her door this morning, that she had opened it, that she was sitting across this table instead of in her apartment with her documentation and her exit plan. She thought about the moment last night when she'd ended his call and set the phone face down on the counter and felt the release of something she'd been carrying. She thought about how clean that had felt. "I want a lawyer present when the paperwork is signed," she said. "Fine. My lawyer, not yours." "Fine." He looked at her steadily. "Claire, are we going to do this?" She held his gaze for a long moment. She felt the situation around her with the specific somatic clarity she sometimes got during the most complex phases of a renovation. The feeling of standing inside a structure and understanding all of its load paths at once, knowing where the stress was distributed, knowing what would hold and what would give. She felt the weight of the last 24 hours pressing on the specific fault lines of the last 14 months. She felt the place where her plan had cracked and the shape of the new terrain that had opened up below it. She thought about the fact that she had come here intending to be controlled and had ended up at a negotiating table. And she thought about what that meant about who she actually was. And she thought about the version of herself on the floor of the East Wing hallway with the putty knife and the tile supplier on hold and 46 more Saturdays ahead of her that she hadn't yet counted. And she understood with the cold precision of someone who has always been better at this than she gave herself credit for, that Damien Calloway had just handed her something more valuable than she'd planned to take. "We're going to do this," she said. She held out her hand across the table. Not warmly, not reconciliatorily, the hand of someone closing a contract. He looked at it for a moment, then he shook it. His grip was firm, and so was hers, and neither of them held on a beat longer than the transaction required. And when she pulled her hand back and stood from the table, she was already thinking about the phone call she needed to make. Not to Tessa, not yet, but to her attorney, a woman named Judith Park, who practiced in the historic district and whom Claire had met at a professional event 2 years ago and had stored in her phone under the category of people you hope you never need and knew she was going to need. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll need the house restored to full service by next Friday," she said. "I'll coordinate the reactivations." "Of course you will," Damien said, and she couldn't tell from his voice whether that was irony or respect or both, and she decided it didn't matter. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he said her name. "Claire." She turned. He was looking at her from the table, the glass in front of him, the rolled sleeves, the overnight in his face. He looked, for a single unguarded moment, like a man who understood that something was ending and did not know yet whether he was the cause of it or the casualty. "The note," he said, "in the kitchen. Did you mean it?" She looked at him. She thought about what she had written. Love without respect is nothing more than convenience wearing the mask of affection. She had written it in one sentence without crossing anything out because it had already been written in her head for a long time before she'd put it on paper. "Every word," she said. She walked out of the Meridian into the Saturday morning, and she pulled her jacket against the October cold, and she found her car, and she sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, her hands on the wheel, her eyes on the street. Her phone had 6 messages from Tessa. She typed back, "I'm fine. Call you in an hour." Then she found Judith Park in her contacts, and she pressed call and listened to it ring. And when Judith answered, slightly surprised at the weekend hour, Claire said, "I need to talk to you about a property agreement. I need it airtight. and I need to understand exactly what I'm signing before I sign anything. She paused. I also need to understand what my exposure looks like if the other party decides the agreement was made under duress. Judith was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a complicated morning's work. I know, Claire said. Can you do it? Come to my office at 11, Judith said. Claire started the car. She pulled into Saturday traffic, the city moving around her at its weekend pace, and she thought about the estate and the restored services, and the Renner dinner and the 2 weekends she'd agreed to, and the paperwork that would come after. She thought about Damien's face in that room, the respect he'd said was his first reaction, and she thought about whether respect that arrives only after you've demonstrated you can hurt someone is a kind of respect worth having. She thought about the handshake. She thought about the word square, and the gap between what it was supposed to mean and what she suspected it actually meant, and the difference between winning a negotiation and surviving one, and the fact that those two things were not always the same, and that she was about to find out which. Judith Park's office smelled like old paper and coffee and the specific dry warmth of a space that has been professionally serious for a long time. It was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building in the historic district, the kind of building that had been a counting house or a law office in every decade of its existence and had never once confused itself with anything more casual. Judith herself was 53, Korean American, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending 30 years in rooms where being the calmest person present was a professional necessity. She had 2 degrees from schools that didn't need to be named because people in certain rooms already knew them, and she practiced in a narrow, specialized corridor of property and contract law that occasionally intersected with the kind of clients who needed things done quietly and correctly and could not afford to have them done any other way. Claire had liked her immediately when they met. She liked her more now, watching Judith listen to the full account of the past 11 months without interrupting once, her pen moving in small, precise notations on the yellow legal pad in front of her, her face giving nothing away. When Claire finished, Judith looked at her notes for a moment. Then she said, "The verbal agreement this morning. He shook your hand." He shook my hand. "Any witnesses?" "No, the room was empty." Judith wrote something. "The accounts. All of them are currently in your name." "All of them. I have the documentation." "Bank records, supplier contracts, utility accounts. All of it. I started keeping records in April. Before April, I have bank statements showing the expenditures, but not always the corresponding project documentation. After April, it's complete." Judith looked up. "How complete?" "Itemized by phase, cross-referenced to the contractor schedule. I have Walt Reeves's invoices, the supplier agreements, the utility account terms, the security system contract, the housekeeping and landscaping service agreements. I have photographs of each phase of the work with date stamps. I have emails." She paused. "I have a lot of emails." Judith looked at her steadily. "You were preparing for this." "I was preparing for something. I didn't know what shape it would take." Judith made another notation. "The property deed. Damien Calloway is the named owner of record." "Yes." "Then what he's offering you, ownership or right of residency, in his words, requires him to either transfer the deed or execute a binding cohabitation or property rights agreement that survives a legal challenge." She tapped the pen against the pad. "The question is what instrument he's going to offer and whether it's worth the paper it's on." "That's why I'm here." "Yes." Judith looked at her. "Claire, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly. All right? Are you afraid of this man?" The question sat in the room. Claire looked at the framed certificates on Judith's wall, the window overlooking the narrow street below, the yellow legal pad with its small, precise notations. She thought about the answer with the same honesty she'd been applying to everything since that Tuesday in October. "Not in the way you mean," she said. "He hasn't threatened me. He hasn't been physical. He's—" She stopped. "He operates in a world where things can go badly for people, and he understands that world completely. He is not separated from it." She met Judith's eyes. "I'm not afraid of what he'll do to me in the next 2 weeks while we're executing this agreement. I'm concerned about what happens after the 2 weeks are over and the paper is signed and I'm no longer useful to him." Judith held her gaze. "That's a useful distinction." She made another note. "I'm going to draft a property transfer agreement, not a right of residency, an actual transfer of ownership. I'm also going to draft a full financial restitution document accounting for your documented expenditures. Both of these will be conditioned on your performance of the 2-weekend agreement. She paused. And I'm going to include a mutual non-disparagement and non-interference clause that will give you something to stand on if his people start making your life difficult after the fact. Can that clause hold against someone like him? Judith looked at her. It was a frank look, the look of someone who respects the question because it's the right question. It gives you documentation, recourse, and time. It won't stop a determined man from being a determined man, but it will slow certain things down and it will make certain things visible. She put down her pen. The best I can do is make the cost of coming after you high enough that it's not the obvious play. I can't make it impossible. I know, Claire said. Do it. The following week moved in the way that weeks move when every day has a specific operational weight. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a purposeful density that made the hours feel inhabited. Claire restored the estate's services in the reverse order she'd suspended them, methodically, making the calls herself because the accounts were still in her name and she was not yet ready to cede that particular form of control. The electricity came back Tuesday, the water Wednesday. She called Rosa Mendez and reinstated the housekeeping schedule. She called the food supplier. She called the linen service. She drove out to the estate Thursday afternoon to walk through it herself, alone, to see what the dark weekend had left behind. It had left almost nothing. The house was cold and still, and the kitchen smelled faintly of the absence of anything warm. But the structure was what it had always been. Her work, her sequencing, her decisions in every room she walked through. She turned the heat on and stood in the great room with the river visible through the clean windows, and she felt the complicated sensation of caring about something that was not yet fully hers and might never be. And she let herself feel it, and then she put it away and took out her phone and called the landscaping crew about the Saturday visit. Judith called Friday morning. The first draft is done, she said. It's thorough. I want to walk you through it before you show it to him. They met at Judith's office for 2 hours. The agreement was 23 pages. Judith walked her through every section with the patience of someone who understands that the person across the desk needs to understand what they're signing as completely as the lawyer who drafted it. Claire asked 14 questions. 3 of them Judith had anticipated. 4 of them caused Judith to make additional notes for a revised section. The remaining 7 were answered in ways that satisfied Claire entirely, which told her the document was solid. She left Judith's office with the agreement in a folder and drove directly to the Meridian. Damien was there. He was always there lately. She'd gathered from Carter Reese's operational efficiency that Damien had essentially relocated to the Meridian for the week, conducting business from the back room, which meant the Renner situation was serious enough to require his physical proximity to whatever the Meridian represented in his organizational infrastructure. She was shown to the back room by a different man this time, younger, who didn't make eye contact. Damien was on the phone. He held up one finger. Wait. And she sat and waited and did not look impatient because she was not impatient. She put the folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it and waited. He finished the call. He looked at the folder. Your lawyer's work? Yes. He reached for it. She didn't stop him. He read it, actually read it, or appeared to, turning the pages with the focused attention of a man who is capable of processing legal language quickly, which she had always known about him, which was one of the things she'd found compelling in the early months before she'd started learning which rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. He read for 11 minutes. She counted by the clock on the wall. He put the last page down. He looked at her. The non-interference clause. Yes. It's broad. It's meant to be. He looked at the page again. She watched his jaw work slightly, the small, muscular tell that appeared when he was deciding something. You think I'd come after you, he said. I think the clause makes it unnecessary for either of us to wonder, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The restitution amount. He named a number. It was her number, from her records, which meant he'd had someone verify her documentation, which meant his people had been working this week too. You want it in a single payment. I want it in a single payment before the second weekend. His eyes came up. Before. She held his gaze. The property transfer can be conditioned on both weekends. The restitution is not conditional. It's a debt, I want it settled independently." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away, and she did not say anything else because she had learned, over 14 months, that with Damien Calloway, the person who speaks first after a silence has already made a concession, and she was done making concessions. "All right," he said. He called for a pen. He initialed the pages his lawyer would need to review before final execution. He was measured about it, unhurried, the same quality of attention he'd given the document when he read it. When he was done, he pushed it back across the table. "Renner dinner is next Saturday," he said. 8 o'clock, 6 people. He paused. "I need you there, Claire. Not just the house. I need you there." She understood what he meant. Not as decoration. He wasn't that crude, or not in that particular way. He needed her there because the Renner people had already seen what the house looked like without her, and her presence at the restored estate would communicate something that no arrangement of furniture or stocked kitchen could communicate on its own. Her presence would say, "The household is intact, the woman is here. Damien Calloway's life is not disordered." It would say the story he needed them to believe. "I'll be there," she said. She picked up the folder. She stood. She was at the door when he said her name again, and she was ready for it this time. She'd been ready for it since the Meridian last Saturday, the way he reached for her name at the last moment as though it were a handhold. "What?" she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. "I'm going to fix this," he said, "between us." She looked at him across the room, across the table, and the amber glass, and the 11 months, and the 47 Saturdays, and the phone left open in a jacket pocket on a Tuesday in October. She looked at him with the specific clarity of a woman who has passed the worst of the grief and is therefore capable of seeing clearly again. "You're going to try," she said. "That's not the same thing." The Renner dinner was a masterwork of controlled presentation, and Claire knew it was a masterwork because she had built the stage and understood every element of it from the inside. She arrived at the estate at 3 in the afternoon, 5 hours before the guests, and she walked through it room by room with the same notebook she'd carried on the first walkthrough with Walt Reeves 14 months ago. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Rosa's crew had been through twice. The kitchen was stocked. The guest rooms were made. The light fixture on the landing cast its designed glow down the main staircase. The fireplace surround in the great room was exactly what she'd envisioned in every detail. Through the cleaned windows, the river was visible in the late afternoon light, moving in its cold October patience. She stood in the great room for a long moment. She stood in it the way you stand in something you made when you are deciding how you feel about the making of it. Damien arrived at 5 with Carter and one other man. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well, and he looked like someone who had slept, finally, which was an improvement. He walked through the main rooms without saying much. In the great room, he stood beside her for a moment and looked out at the river. "It's exactly right," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. She did not look back at him. She was looking at the river. The Renner people arrived at 8:15. There were 6 of them. A man named Gerald Renner, who was 70, and moved like someone 20 years younger and had the specific, unhurried quality of a man who has not needed to prove himself for a very long time, accompanied by 2 men she identified as his lieutenants, a lawyer, and 2 others whose function she didn't determine and didn't need to. They came in through the main entrance, and the house received them the way she'd designed it to receive people. The scale of the entry hall, the light on the staircase, the warmth coming from the main rooms, the smell of a kitchen in use. Gerald Renner stopped in the entry hall and looked around with the attention of a man assessing a property. He took in the millwork. He took in the staircase. He looked at the light fixture on the landing. He looked briefly at Claire. Damien made the introduction. "Claire Whitmore. She's responsible for the estate." Gerald Renner shook her hand. His grip was dry and firm. "You did this work yourself?" he said. "I managed it," she said, "with a contractor I trust." "How long?" 14 months from first walkthrough to finish." He looked around the entry hall again. "My wife would have taken 3 years and spent twice what this cost." He said it without humor, as a simple comparative assessment. "She has good taste, but no patience for execution." Claire said nothing. She smiled in the way you smile when someone has paid you a compliment they don't realize is more complicated than it appears. Dinner was the other half of the stage. She had planned the menu herself, coordinated the catering through a service she'd used on 2 commercial project openings, chosen the wines from a list Damien had approved without reviewing closely. The dining room table was set for 8. The river was visible through the uncurtained window. The whole arrangement communicated exactly what it was meant to communicate. A household of consequence, a man whose life was organized and substantial, a home that had been built rather than purchased. She watched Gerald Renner during dinner with the peripheral attention she'd developed over years of managing rooms full of people, the skill of tracking a space without appearing to track it. He ate well. He was engaged in the conversation without leading it. He asked questions about the estate, the acreage, the renovation scope, the river access. And his questions were the questions of a man who understands property as a measure of something beyond the property itself. Once, during a pause in the conversation, he looked at Claire with a directness that had nothing social in it and said, "You managed all of this while running your own firm?"
"Yes," she said. "At the same time." At the same time. He looked at Damien. He did not say anything. He went back to his wine. But she had been watching, and she had seen the thing that passed across his face in that brief moment of looking at Damien. An assessment, a recalculation, the expression of a man who has just processed new information about the arrangement in front of him. She understood what he had calculated. He had calculated that the woman across the table had built this house, had run it, had kept it running, and that the man beside her had been a recipient of that work rather than a participant in it. And he had calculated what that meant about Damien Calloway's domestic infrastructure. And she understood that this calculation was not unfavorable to her. After dinner, while Damien walked the Renner people through the grounds, the riverside access, the pool house, the perimeter, she stood in the kitchen with a glass of water and listened to the voices carry faintly from outside and thought about the second weekend, the follow-up, the conditions of the agreement. She thought about Judith's revised draft, which was sitting in her apartment in a folder marked Final, which Damien's attorney had reviewed and returned with 3 minor amendments, all of which Judith had accepted as inconsequential. She thought about Gerald Renner's face when he'd looked at Damien. She was still thinking about it when Carter Reese appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her for a moment. He had the look of a man who has been watching a situation for longer than the people inside it and has arrived at conclusions they haven't reached yet. "You should know something," he said. She looked at him. She waited. Renner called Damien this afternoon. Before they arrived. Carter's voice was low, even. Not a confession. A transfer of information, the way a man passes something he's decided you need to carry. He said the deal is back on. The suspension is lifted. She absorbed this. Then tonight isn't necessary. Tonight is about something else now. He held her gaze. Renner wants to know who you are. Specifically, what your arrangement is with Damien, what your role is. He paused. He made inquiries, this week, about your firm, your background. She felt something shift in the room, not fear. She had established some time ago that fear was not the useful response to new information, that the useful response was to understand the new information as precisely as possible. Why? Carter looked at her for a long moment. Because Renner's organization has a property division, legitimate real estate, renovation management, commercial development. And because someone in that organization apparently looked at what's happened to this estate in the past 14 months and had a conversation with Gerald Renner about the person who managed it. He stopped. "I'm telling you this because I said I'd tell you when the situation shifted." She looked at him. She thought about the handshake in the back room last Saturday. She thought about the non-interference clause. She thought about Damien saying, "I'm going to fix this between us," and her response, "You're going to try," and the gap between those two things. "Does Damien know Renner made inquiries about me?" she said. Carter held her gaze. "He does now." She set down the water glass. Outside, she could hear the voices from the grounds, Damien's among them, the measured cadences of men walking and talking about money and property in the October dark. She thought about what Damien had heard. She thought about what he would do with what he'd heard. She thought about the specific arithmetic of a man who has just discovered that the woman he undervalued has become, through his own negligence, interesting to someone he needs. She thought about the handshake. She thought about the folder. She thought about 23 pages of Judith Park's precise legal work and whether it was going to be enough to hold a line that had just moved. Her phone was in her jacket pocket.
She could feel its weight. She thought about Judith's number, the speed dial, the 11-minute drive from the historic district to the estate if she needed her here and not just on a phone line. She thought about Gerald Renner's face at the dinner table and the recalculation she'd watched move through it, and she understood that she had just become a piece on a board that was larger than the one she'd been playing on, and that the rules of this new board were ones she did not fully know, and that the man who had invited her to play on his board without telling her the rules was about to walk back through that kitchen door with the specific expression of someone who has decided that she is no longer simply a problem. He is managing, but a variable. He needs to. Damien came through the kitchen door at 9:51. She knew his walk by its sound before she saw his face, the specific weight and cadence of it, the way his shoes met a floor with a purposeful evenness that was neither hurried nor casual, but something in between, the walk of a man who has decided where he is going before he begins moving. She had learned that walk the way you learn the acoustics of a house you've lived in for a long time, by proximity and repetition and the unconscious calibration of someone who is always, on some level, paying attention. Carter had already gone. He had looked at her once more before he left the kitchen, a look that asked no question and offered no comfort, and was therefore, in its honesty, more useful than either. Then he had walked back toward the main rooms, and she had been alone in the kitchen with her water glass, and the weight of what he'd told her and the sound of voices from outside growing gradually louder as the group made their way back from the grounds. Damien came in alone. He closed the door behind him. He looked at her, and she saw it immediately. Not the operational stillness she'd learned to read as danger, but something older and less managed underneath it. Something that had been sitting in him since Carter had told him about Renner's inquiry. Something that had been crystallizing through the dinner and the grounds tour and the careful performance of the past 3 hours. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has miscalculated profoundly and has only just now understood the full scope of his miscalculation. "You knew," he said. "Carter told me 20 minutes ago. Before that." He moved to the kitchen island and put both hands flat on it, the same posture she'd used across a table from him last Saturday, and she understood this as something other than coincidence. "You knew that whatever you built out here was going to say something about you, to anyone who looked." "I knew it said something about me," she said. "I didn't know Gerald Renner was going to be looking." He studied her face. "He wants to meet with you, separately. His property development arm is looking for a managing director for a new division, renovation, commercial repositioning, high-value residential. He described what he's looking for tonight on the walk." His voice was controlled, but the control was costing something. "He described you, without knowing he was describing you." She said nothing. She held the water glass and let the information settle into its proper place. "He's going to make you an offer," Damien said. "He doesn't know me. He knows your work. He's been in 4 rooms of it tonight, and he spent 20 minutes on the grounds asking me specific questions about project management, timeline, budget control, contractor relationships." He paused. "I answered them honestly. I don't know why I did that." She looked at him. "Maybe because you were finally in a room where the truth was the better play." Something moved through his face. Not anger. Something that had been trying to become anger for several days and kept arriving as something more uncomfortable. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to meet with him," she said. "If he makes an offer, I'll evaluate it." "Claire, Damien." She set the glass down. She turned to face him fully, which she had been avoiding, and now she didn't avoid it. She looked at him directly, at the face she'd looked at across tables and pillows and the specific shared geography of 14 months, and she let herself feel the full weight of what this conversation was and what it was ending, and then she spoke from the other side of that weight. "You need to hear something, not as a negotiation, not as a setup for anything, just the truth." He was very still. "I loved you," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think you've been telling yourself a version of this where I was always just waiting for the moment to burn you, and that's not what happened. I loved you, and I built that house because I loved you, and I believed the house was going to become something we shared." She held his gaze. "That's the version that's true. And the other version that's also true is that you let me build it alone, and you took credit for what I built. And you laughed at the cost it took from me in front of men whose respect you valued more than you valued mine. Both versions are true. I need you to know I understand that." Damien's hands were still flat on the island. She watched the tendons in his forearms, the slow, controlled breath he took, the way a man disciplines himself back from the edge of something he doesn't want to show. "I'm not a good man," he said. It was the most unadorned thing she had ever heard him say. No management in it, no performance, nothing aimed at producing a reaction. Just a sentence delivered with the particular flatness of a truth that has been known for a long time and rarely spoken aloud. "I know that," she said. "I knew it going in. I thought I could hold on to the parts of you that were." She paused. "That was my mistake, not loving you, thinking the good parts were the majority." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen around them was warm and finished and exactly what she'd designed it to be, and the river was doing its thing outside the dark window, and somewhere in the main rooms Carter and the others were waiting for whatever came next. "Renner's offer," he said finally. "If you take it, is that the end of this?" "This ended before the Renner dinner," she said. "The offer is something different, something that's mine. You don't get to decide whether I take it." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the specific quality of a proud man understanding the limits of his reach, which was a thing she had not been sure he was capable of until this moment. "The agreement," he said. "The property. The restitution. I'm honoring those." "I know you are," she said. "You gave me your word and you have whatever this version of integrity is that you carry. You have it. I've always known that about you too." He looked almost pained by that, as though being credited with the specific, limited integrity he possessed was worse than being accused of having none at all. "I'm going back in," she said. "You should come in a minute. Don't make them wait." She walked past him toward the main rooms. She did not touch him as she passed. There was a moment, 2 feet between them in the kitchen she had built, where the air had the weight of everything unspoken and both of them felt it, and neither of them reached for it. Then she was past it and through the door and back into the warm light of the great room where Gerald Renner was standing at the window, looking at the dark river, his hands in his pockets. The posture of a man who is comfortable with silence. He turned when she came in. He looked at her with the same direct assessment he'd used at dinner. "Walk me through the staircase detail," he said, "the newel post work." She walked him through it. She talked about the carpenter she'd sourced in November, the specific profile of the post cap, the way the wood grain had been matched across the 3 replacement balusters, the particular finish that had taken 4 attempts to get right. She talked about it the way she always talked about her work, precisely, without overselling, with the specific authority of someone who has stood inside the problem and worked until the problem became a solution. Gerald Renner listened. He asked 2 questions that demonstrated he knew more about millwork than most clients knew, which told her something about where he'd come from before he'd become what he was now. He nodded at both of her answers in the way that someone nods when an answer confirms something they already suspected. When she finished, he looked at the staircase for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to have a conversation with you this week. A business conversation. Are you available?" "I'll make myself available," she said. He nodded once. That was the entire exchange. He went back to his wine and the room regrouped around its conversational patterns, and Damien came in from the kitchen 3 minutes later, and the evening continued to its conclusion. The second weekend, the follow-up Damien had asked for, was a lunch, not a dinner, 4 people, 2 hours. Claire was present. She was professional and composed, and she managed the room the way she always managed rooms, with the peripheral competence of someone who knows how every element works because they put every element in place themselves. Gerald Renner was not present at this one. It was 2 of his lieutenants, a follow-up to the previous Saturday, and after an hour and a half, Damien walked them to their car and came back to find Claire in the kitchen, her jacket on, her bag on her shoulder. He looked at her. He understood what the jacket and the bag meant. "This is the second weekend," she said. "I know. Judith will send the executed documents to your attorney by end of business Friday." She paused. "The restitution payment came through yesterday." "Thank you." He stood in the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked like a man at a particular kind of ending. Not a dramatic one, not a scene, just the plain and irreversible ending of a thing that had been ending for some time. "Will you tell me something honestly?" he said. "If I can. Did you plan all of this? From the beginning, the accounts, the documentation?" "No," she said. "The accounts happened because you were unavailable and the work needed to happen. The documentation started in April because I noticed the accounts were in my name, and I'm not careless about money. She met his eyes. The plan happened in October, after the phone call. He was quiet for a moment. You heard the whole thing. I heard the whole thing. His jaw shifted. His eyes went to the window, the river, the November light that was colder and flatter than October had been. What I said, about the smell. He stopped. He said it the way you say a thing when you have been carrying it for weeks and are tired of its weight. I was being a version of myself I'm not proud of.
I know, she said. You told me. She picked up her bag. Damien, don't make it smaller than it was by apologizing for the part that's easiest to apologize for. You didn't just say something unkind. You let those men believe that what I did here meant nothing, that I was here because I needed something to keep me occupied. She looked at him steadily. I was here because I loved you. That's not a small thing to dismiss. He looked at her. He looked at her with the full attention he was capable of, which was considerable, which she had always known was considerable, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide from it and never had. I know, he said, quietly. I know what it was. She nodded. She moved toward the door. He didn't stop her, and she didn't expect him to, and the fact that he didn't was the most honest thing he'd done in the entire 14 months. She walked through the entry hall and out the main door and across the gravel drive to her car. The November sky was low and gray, and the live oaks along the drive had lost most of their leaves, which she hadn't seen happen before because in all the Saturdays she'd spent at this estate, she had never been here when the trees changed. She looked at them as she walked. She put the image in the specific place where you put things you are going to carry. She got in the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Through the windshield, she could see the estate, the finished facade, the clean lines, the millwork around the main door she'd painted herself on a Saturday in September when it was still warm enough to work outdoors. She looked at it the way you look at a completed project, with the particular mixture of satisfaction and release that comes when a thing you've poured yourself into is done and you can finally see it as a whole. She started the car. She pulled down the long drive through the live oaks. She did not look in the rearview mirror. Gerald Renner's offer arrived in a formal letter the following Thursday, routed through his attorney to Judith, who called Claire the moment it came in. It's serious, Judith said. The title is Managing Director, Property Development Division. The scope is... She paused, and Claire heard papers turning. Significant. Commercial renovation, high-value residential repositioning, project oversight on a portfolio of 17 properties across Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. The compensation is... Another pause. Claire, it's a serious number. Claire sat in her office at the firm, at the desk where she'd sat for 9 years, looking at the framed print on the wall that she'd bought before she met Damien. What are the conditions? Standard executive contract, 18-month initial term, renewable. Reporting directly to Renner. Judith paused. There's nothing in it that looks like a trap. I've read it twice. It's a job offer, a very good one. Claire looked at the print on the wall. She thought about what Tessa would say. She knew what Tessa would say. She would say, take it, and she would be right. And she would also be honest enough to say that taking it meant restructuring the firm, redistributing her client load, a significant change to the shape of the life she and Tessa had built together, which was a cost and a real one. She thought about what it meant to have this offer exist at all, that it had come from the wreckage of something she'd built for the wrong reasons, that it was the part of the past 14 months that had been hers all along, the competence and the vision and the discipline, extracted from the context of love and loss and handed back to her as something clean. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen island, the single sentence she'd written. She thought about how she'd written it, thinking it was the end of something, not knowing it was also the beginning. Tell them I'll need a week to review, she said. Of course, Judith said. Claire, for what it's worth, you should take it. I know, she said. She called Tessa next. The conversation was an hour long and covered the firm, the Hargrove project, 4 other active clients, the lease situation, and the possibility of restructuring Claire's role to a senior consulting capacity that would let her take the Renner position while maintaining a formal relationship with the firm. Tessa did not say I told you so, which was one of the many reasons Claire had spent 9 years building a business with her. She said,
You've been doing two people's jobs for 14 months. You might as well get paid for it by someone who actually notices. Claire laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unself-conscious, the first one in a long time that arrived without cost. She signed the renter agreement on a Wednesday in November in Judith's office. With the river country smell of autumn coming through a window, Judith had opened an inch. She signed the property documents the same day. The Calloway estate, transferred to her name, full ownership, clean and legal, and witnessed by two people who had no stake in the outcome except professional accuracy. Judith handed her the final copy in a folder, and she put it in her bag, and that was that. The first Monday of December, she drove out to the estate alone. She had a key. She had always had a key. She had set the locks, and she let herself in and walked through the rooms in the early morning light. The heat was on. The kitchen was clean. Everything was exactly as she had left it, which was exactly as she had built it. She walked through slowly. She went room by room the way she'd done on every inspection, but different now. Not assessing, not cataloging, not calculating what still needed to happen. Just looking. Letting the rooms be what they were, which was the accumulated evidence of a year of her life, its difficulty and its skill and the specific stubbornness that had kept her going on the days when the project was hard and the loneliness was harder. She stood in the great room for a long time. Through the cleaned windows, the river was winter gray and moving, unhurried, going where it was always going. The live oaks outside had lost their leaves entirely and stood in their stripped patience, waiting for whatever came next. She thought about Damien. She let herself think about him without the management and the numbness she'd been using to keep the thinking at a functional distance. She thought about the parts that had been real, the compression of his voice, the way he'd looked at her laugh that first night, the 11 months during which his faith in her competence had been, in its narrow way, genuine, even when everything surrounding it was not. She thought about him in the Meridian back room saying, "I'm not a good man," with the flatness of a long-known truth. And she thought about what it cost a man like that to say that plainly, and she gave it its proper weight without giving it more than it deserved. She was not going to be the woman who turned a man's self-knowledge into an excuse for the harm he'd caused. But she was also not going to be the woman who simplified a complicated thing into a clean story about a villain and his victim, because she was smarter than that, and the truth was smarter than that, and the truth was what she had decided to live in. She had loved him badly, and he had failed her badly, and the failing had been worse than the loving, but both of them had been real. And she was going to carry both of them with the same honesty she brought to everything else in her life, which was the only way she knew how to carry things. She thought about Carter Reese in her hallway, the thing he'd decided not to say, and she thought that whatever it was, she hoped she would not have needed to know it, and she thought that was probably the correct way to leave it. She looked at the room. She thought about what she was going to do with it, not immediately, but over time. The estate was hers, and she had a job now that paid a serious number, and she had documentation and clarity and the specific freedom of a person who has closed the account correctly. She thought about a guest room for Tessa, who had been talking about leaving the city for weekends for as long as Claire had known her. She thought about the pool house and its resolved mold situation and what it could become with the right renovation brief, which she was now professionally qualified to write. She thought about this room on a summer evening, the windows open, the river sound coming in, people she chose eating food she'd prepared because she wanted to and not because someone needed her to complete a performance. She let that image sit in the room with her for a while. Then she picked up her bag and she took her phone out, and she texted Tessa. "Are you free this weekend? I want to show you something." She looked at the sent message. She put her phone away. She walked to the main door and she took one more look at the great room. The fireplace surround, the river windows, the light coming in at its December angle, everything finished, everything hers. And she turned off the light the way you turn off a light in a room you are going to come back to, without ceremony, without wait, just a clean, ordinary act at the end of a morning. She closed the door. She crossed the gravel to her car. The oaks stood in their winter patience along the drive, and the river made its sound beyond them, and the sky was the specific gray of a Georgia December that isn't bleak but is honest, that doesn't promise spring or threaten winter but simply is what it is, today's light doing today's work. She drove the 40 minutes back to the city. She had meetings in the afternoon. She had a property file to review for Renner, 17 buildings, a scope of work that would take most of the year, work that was hers in every sense that mattered. She had a business partner who was also her friend and who had been right about things before and would be right about things again, and would never say so in a way that made it unbearable. She had a table at the Thai restaurant in 3 weeks. She had a life that was entirely her own and had always been, even in the 14 months she'd spent building someone else's. Damien Calloway continued to run his organization with the same cold precision that had made him what he was. The Renner negotiation eventually concluded on terms that were acceptable to both parties, though never quite what either had originally wanted. Carter Reese remained his most trusted man. The Meridian remained his operational center. He was, by any external measure, exactly what he had always been. He did not contact Claire after the documents were signed. This was either respect or calculation, or both. With Damien, the distinction had never been simple, and she did not contact him, and the months passed with the ordinary weight of months, accumulating into a distance that became its own kind of answer. She heard once, through a professional contact, that he had driven past the estate on the river road, that he had slowed the car, that he had not stopped. She heard this, and she held it briefly and she let it go, the way you release a thing when you've decided the carrying of it belongs to someone else now. She never heard from him directly. She did not miss him the way she'd expected to, which told her something about the difference between missing a person and missing the version of your life that had been organized around them. The second kind of missing was real, and it took longer to pass. She let it take as long as it needed. By spring, the pool house renovation was underway. By summer, Tessa had spent 3 weekends at the estate and was talking about buying land further up the river, which was a good sign, the sign of a person who has experienced a place and wants to be near it rather than in it, which is the correct relationship with someone else's home. By fall, the Renner portfolio was 2 properties lighter and 4 projects deeper, and Claire had hired a project associate, a young woman named Simone, who reminded her of the version of herself she'd been 10 years ago. Competent, slightly underpaid, learning to trust her own eye. And she paid Simone well and told her what she thought without softening it, and gave her the kind of work that would teach her things she couldn't learn in school. The estate on the river became what she had imagined it could be, the first time she'd stood in it with a flashlight and a notebook and a clear idea of what was possible. Not a monument, not a performance, just a place that was hers, that she had made from something broken, that the river ran past every morning without caring about any of the things that had happened on its banks. She stood at the great room window one evening in October, a year, almost exactly, since the Tuesday with the putty knife and the open phone line and the sentence she had not been meant to hear, and she watched the river move in the late light, and she felt the particular quality of a life that is genuinely, unperformatively her own. She was not healed in the clean, completed way that stories sometimes suggest. She was changed, which is different. Changed by what she'd built, and what she'd lost, and what she'd refused to lose, and the years she'd spent understanding the difference between those things. She carried what she carried, and she didn't carry what she'd put down, and she knew the difference between them, which was, she thought, the most you could ask of a year. The river moved, the light fell, the house held. She turned from the window and went back to her work.